about that since. But bottom line, I'm going to go through a couple of slides here and hopefully cover all the aspects of what I see in the 3D seismic. And in the last 2 months, we've had a lot of new data come to my hands. And two in particular. One, we got a more competent set of 3D data from the 2007 Legend seismic data. And we also got a hold of the actual field records for this particular 3D acquisition that was taken back in March. And part of my duty here was to reprocess this data and basically define the integrity of Texas brines processing and acquisition. Because I know there was a question across the board. So we went to a third-party processor, a very well-known, world-renowned group of exploration and processing geophysicists that I've worked with in the past. And we took the data and basically went through a very methodical approach to reviewing all these field records again and reprocessing the data to determine that what Texas brines processing had good integrity or not. And I'm here to tell you that it does have good integrity, but going to this new geophysical processor allows us to get higher resolution data. They have a lot of patented products. They've got some of the best geophysicists that I know in the world that I got to consult with on this project, and we've reprocessed the data. And even though Texas brines data integrity and acquisition is good, I feel like we've got the best resolution that I could obtain out of this data set. So what I ended up doing in the last 2 months was basically starting at ground zero again. Because one, I wanted to go back with all of this new data out here and establish where the salt was. And we've got a lot of good control points for it. Primarily, we have all the historical wells, probably about 2, maybe 3 dozen wells. Have to tie that in with all of our vertical seismic profiles that were shot in this area from 2010 to early this year. Tie that with the new acquisition that Texas Brine acquired, and take all the reprocessing data and also the new Legend 2007 3D data, combine and integrate all of that information. So from January to today, we went from 1/3 of a square mile of unknown seismic and well control to a volume of data. So I stepped back and said, first, where's the salt? And as you can see on the screen, I'm just going to give you a caricature picture of this, and the rest of the slides basically show you what the profile of this salt looks like on the side. And primarily in the area that the salt is going to be represented in yellow on all the rest of the illustrations. And it's in the area of the salt dome that's to the east of the sinkhole. It's primarily about 700-foot flat tabletop. And when you go to the west in the area of the sinkhole, consider jumping off like a 7,000-foot cliff. It becomes vertical. And it has a little bit of crenulations on the side, but for the most part, it's a very vertical face. And it's difficult to image with such a small seismic acquisition of 2 square miles. Then my next step was basically to, once I identified the salt, was to look for disturbance outside of the salt. And how we end up doing that is the sedimentary layers on the left side of the green represent very, very continuous reflection events. And then the salt, once that's defined, becomes an interface that we can bound those reflectors on the left with the salt. So anything in between yellow and green, I can say that is my maximum interpretation of the disturbance area. If we didn't realize that there was hydraulic connection between the cavern and the sinkhole, I would say that that would be our maximum uncertainty of where the salt position is. So where the disturbance is between the green and the yellow boundaries. And that was my next step in doing a 6-step approach. Third, to understand the subsurface conditions more, I wanted to look at outside of the disturbance and understand the physical geology of the rock record from 0 to 7,000 feet. And that's important because we need to know what type of influence the layered rocks look like as we go down through the disturbance area down to the cavern depth. And then finally, once we've identified salt and disturbance and the subsurface conditions all the way down to the cavern depth, I need to look for hydrocarbons. And here's what I've looked for, is that once I see disturbance, hydrocarbons that could be causing bubbling up to the surface, migration into the aquifer, migration into the lenses of sand in the aquitard, which bound the aquifer, any hydrocarbons that could come into the system, I believe, are adjacent to or within that green volume.
There's just a little confusion because of the background. The yellow line is a vertical profile, okay, on the western side of the salt. It's not related to the caverns you see here. The yellow line is a vertical profile, and the disturbed rock zone is green. Again, that's a vertical profile. So you're looking at the edge of the salt like this. You're
it's a side
at the
profile.
western side of the dome.
And it's a side schematic. I'm just trying to illustrate what it would look like in a cartoon sense before I show them the real data.
Right.
Okay. All right. Is that all clear to you? Hopefully, Gary will correct me if I don't get anything clear in the future. So I took the 6-step approach because I had to step back to the very beginning because I had all this data. Let me also just kind of step back with the evolution of data over the last 9 months. And this goes into what we've actually talked about. I just talked about a minute ago. When I first stepped into the project, we had a handful of wells that were built between 1920 and early 2000s. And I had to tie those rock records to basically one vertical seismic profile and a small subset of seismic that was obtained from the landowner. And in normal senses, I know it looks like a large scale on this map, but a third of a square mile of unknown seismic background and one vertical seismic profile with well control around here is not a whole lot to work with. So there wasn't a lot of definition, so there was a lot of possibilities out there. Moving to March, as you can see, there was a number of vertical seismic profiles or slices of the earth that Texas brine had taken to further identify the salt interface in this area. Moving to April, they acquired 3D seismic. And with this, we went from poorer resolution to finer resolution. And this was the final pre-plot of where the actual receiver lines, which are the geophones, were laid out in blue, and the red were the source or energy points that we put into the ground. Some were along the bayou, which are air guns, some were vibrators, which are in the community, but the majority of this acquisition was the source or energy shot holes. And that's what we originally took a look at in April, and they delivered their process product in the 1st of April by the deadline that was demanded of them. And in July, late July, they finally acquired a full competent data set of the 2011 Legend data set, which is coarser in resolution. They have points of control, or what we call bins in the subsurface, on an 82.5 by 82.5 spacing. However, even though we got that full data set, it appears that to the right side of this red squiggly line, there was very few source and receivers, primarily probably because they did not have a permit to put a lot of their geophones or their source records onto the facilities that are present there today. That's an assumption of mine. I don't have the actual acquisition, so all I have is the data to work with. But it does look like we're limited in our shallow seismic record by the data that they purchased in July. And then finally, we moved to August, and that's the reprocessing data. We're now comparing 82.5-foot bin spacings to 37.5, which is very, very fine resolution. So that's the evolution of data. So that's why this interpretation has gone through its modification and tweaks over time. Primarily because we've been getting this data trickling in over time, and it's going to modify our interpretation, or at least modify mine. So what's the result? The result on this map this is a combination caprock and salt contour map. So we've taken all of these volumes of data, including the wells, the VSPs, the three-dimensional seismic profiles, and I put together my best interpretation of the salt in a contour form. And what you see on this map, you've got the well control points, which are green and red. These are historical wells drilled between like 1925 and 2001. You've got all of the seismic control, and you build all these things together, and the blue represents the distribution of the caprock. And the caprock is defined as a layer of anhydrite and other carbonate materials that's common on top of salt. And so its distribution is about 400 feet below the surface. It's almost tabletop, and where it becomes red, it starts to go over the edge of the salt dome. And that's usually where the sheath or the thick caprock starts or stops. The contours, as you can see, are from salt. And the salt is about 700 feet below the surface, all the way in the area to the east of the blue. And then you drop off on that cliff. And that's where the contours get steep. And that's what we're trying to image. Where the two caverns are that are on this map for just for reference, this is the Oxy 1 maximum area as it's projected to the surface. This is the Oxy 3 area. And in pink, this is where our new 3,000-foot geophone well was drilled in between those two. So what does this look like? I'm going to give you a slice of this three-dimensional survey in an east-west direction, going across from the top of the salt to the edge of the salt. And this is the processing that we did. I want to show you that. So as a quick summary, we went from taking this old data set, got back to January, and had coarse contouring to a full interpretation of this western side of the Napoleonville Salt Dome. So this is what this picture looks like, and this is the reprocessing that I worked with over the last 2 months. On the left-hand screen is something we call a time migration, or a seismic time migration. And on the right hand is something we call coherence. And this kind of gives you the profile as if we slice through the earth, east to west. You'll see salt on the right side, which is made up of these very chaotic reflectors. And then you see on the left-hand side of this yellow line, very uniform reflectors over here. This is from time, that yellow line is now defining the salt interface for me. And then on the outside of that salt interface, I see these crenulations along the surface, and then these quiet areas in the seismic, and that represents the maximum disturbance that could be in the rock record, caused by this sidewall region of the cavern. And as you see on the right-hand side, this is something that we call coherence, or is another processing version of the one on the left. And where salt is present, because it has these chaotic, incoherent trace-to-trace relationships in the seismic, it will sometimes show up as black. And then the very top of it, where it's showing up as white, this is where we're getting these echoes. I call these multiples last time I was here, but I was waving my hand and trying to illustrate that with flapping my wings, and didn't go over very well. So we have, from this new seismic process, a very, very high resolution picture of the salt interface. In green is the outside limit of my maximum interpretation of disturbance. We see these reflection layers here, which represent layered sedimentary rock. And then we also see at the very top, this is going right through the center of the sinkhole, an area that looks like kind of a cone shape up in here. The light blue line represents a 400-foot sonar depth back in December of 2012 for scale. And then the very bottom of that picture has a 750-foot total depth from the tape measure that John Boudreaux put in the ground. One thing to step back and remember, this is a static picture of the Earth, March 2013. They were only acquiring seismic records between March 16th and March 24th. So even though I put a 750-foot depth on these maps, this is only for scale. So this is what the sinkhole and the sidewall face of the salt look like during late March. Now what's nice about this is the high resolution processing that I got out of the data from the reprocessors that I worked with in the last 2 months. I can take the same interpretation and port it over to Texas Brines data. And what you see, even though it's a little bit more coarser processing and lower frequency, you still see the same type of interpretation. At least I, from a geophysical viewpoint, see the same in elements in the subsurface as I saw on the high resolution data. So that gives me that integrity, the integrity look of the seismic. I see the salt in the same position as they're processing. I see similar elements in the subsurface, which I call acoustically quiet areas that could represent disturbance. I also see the same type of upper cone or depression, which is the disturbance underneath the sinkhole, which is shown up as incoherent or black areas. And I also, you can notice that their coherency, and this is a processing and a patent issue, people call coherency different things, but it's very similar. And that's actually what they call this version of coherence. They call it a similarity. And the salt shows up as this modeling. I like what this processing shows me because it gives me a confidence level that our processing and their processing is very similar. We're seeing the same thing, so I can use them in concert with one another. Moving forward, this is the beauty of looking at the 2007 data now. They purchased this data, and I got my chance to look at it in late July. And now I can compare the 2013 data to the 2007 data on the right. And as you can see, there's a big picture change. I mean, even from a non-geophysical viewpoint, I look at the data on the left, high resolution, high reflectivity, good imaging of the salt. However, even though the data on the right-hand side, I'm not going to be able to reach there, is coarser, I can see the same elements of salt. And again, you have to work with the data for a long time and have a little bit of experience with it to see these things. But basically, this is where I get my interpretation that the salt is primarily in the same position 6 years ago. However, because the resolution is coarser, you don't see all of the elements of faulting. And now I've got somewhat of a quasi before-after picture to be able to determine what was there before, what was there afterwards. And one of the things that I see has changed dramatically is these areas of disturbance outside, where you really don't see a whole lot of that on the before picture. The unfortunate part of working with the 2007 data is that there's a shallow seismic record gap. And even though we have a lot more data in the 2013 arena, we don't really see a whole lot of things that we can compare directly as to what the sinkhole area looked like 6 years ago before today. It's unfortunate, but that's just the way we that's the data that we have to work with. One of the things that I do see in here, though, which is somewhat important to me, is really the salt boundary. And now I can actually look at some of those possible hydrocarbon events that I mentioned back in April. I saw 10 possible anomalies. Now I have a chance to actually condemn them, advocate them, or change them. And in summary of the result of that work, I now see that some of the oil and gas anomalies that I saw at depth now are not part of this hydrocarbon or this hydraulic communication highway, as I call it, between the cavern depth and the surface. So some of those seem to be trapped and not part of it, and I think the majority of the hydrocarbons that are causing the bubbling and causing the saturation in the aquifer are between 1,000 and 1,500 feet. And that's also in the same range where we're seeing a lot of the micro-earthquake activity. But Will talk more about that, or Dr. Pettit will talk more about that. And also, it makes a lot of sense that if this cone up in here at the shallow level is in communication with camp rock, it tells us that there could be geochemistry changes in the water. So this all works in concert with the other disciplines that are working on this project. So it's a nice way to integrate all of the different sciences to understand the subsurface. So what happens when we take a time lapse of, the next slide is a video, and it actually shows you what this salt phase and interpretation looks like in a three-dimensional viewpoint. And what you do with 3D seismic is you build a salt interface from looking at every single line, every 37.5 feet, different azimuths and slices, and you can create the salt wall in yellow, a disturbance volume in green, and compare it to the rock outside of it. And this will replay, and I'll try to stop it in the middle of it so we can discuss a couple of points about it. This is a slice of the earth at about 5,000 feet. The yellow is the interpretation that I made of the salt interface. The green is an interpretation of the maximum area of disturbance that I can see in the seismic record. And the distance from yellow to green is probably in the order of 550 to 575 feet in maximum width, and it seems to coalesce with the modeling that Itasca does. Now, the model doesn't actually fit the seismic data, and we're working with that to integrate in a best judgment as to how this actually works and how the hydraulics works between the surface and the cavern. But this is one part of the equation. This is one part of the interpretation. And this is what I do, and then Itasca will take it to the next level and determine how far things will move, how this affects the sinkhole, substance, all of the materials. It all works together, but my interpretation gets then ported over to them, and they do more geomechanical discipline studies of this. The other thing you see in here is purple is the outline of the Oxy 3 cavern. And I'm going to continue to play this. And I picked this particular slice primarily because, back on that. I picked this particular slice because it represents where I think the salt comes in closest proximity to the Oxy 3 cavern, which is about 5,300 feet. And I think if there was any position that a sidewall breach could have occurred, it would be in that range. We know by the studies of the disciplines of the Blue Ribbon Commission that a sidewall breach occurred, and my part of this integrated study is to tell them where the approximate position would be. So it all works together with all the teams out here. Last thing I'll do on this particular slide is stop it in the middle of it and actually show you some other events that you can pull out of the 3D seismic. You'll notice that inside the yellow wall is very dark. That's where the salt is incoherent. The trace-to-trace positions do not correlate very well, so it shows up as a black event. Come outside the salt, it's white and black. But you also see these delineations. These are radiating faults that come out of the salt dome that also show up as incoherent areas. The other thing that you see, if I move the video up just a little bit more, you'll see these other delineations which represent sand channels, which are really interesting. These are like paleo bayous. So there's like a levee, then you see a sand channel, and then another levee on the other side, and that's what's represented by this type of rock record here, and this type of anomaly right in here. So you might have a channel, a levee boundary, another channel. So the high resolution processing that we got out of our group and that we've been working with really pulled everything that I possibly could get out of this small survey. And it helped me make a more, I guess you could say, competent interpretation, but it's still my best judgment as to what's there. Moving forward, the next step, now that I have a salt position, now that I have a maximum disturbance position, and I understand the structural conditions outside the salt, the next step is what's feeding the bubbling of the surface. And with the data before and after, and the evolution of data that we got over the last 9 months, I've limited to the likely gas sources that are a zone at 1,500 feet and one at 1,000 feet. The ones that are at 2,000 and 3,000 and 4,000, they have less chance of being culprits for feeding this vertical hydraulic highway, if you call it, of disturbance. And where do these fit in the overall picture? We'll go to the next step. The gases that I think are feeding the aquifer, and the gases that I think are feeding the bubbling at the surface, are dominantly coming from 3 areas. And it's going to be the integrated discipline of all of the team here to determine how much of these gases influence the final product that we see at the surface. But I think the reservoirs that are, the oil and gas that's coming to the surface is coming up from small reservoirs that are adjacent to the salt, in between this disturbance area that I can't map because they've been disturbed. And the 2007 data is too coarse for me to actually map it. The other areas are salt and caprock dissolution. Makes sense. Got a little bit of gas that comes out of crystallization of salt when you dissolve it or when you drill it. The other part, which is my part of the discipline, is try to look for oil and gas in here. So the third element would be those reservoirs that are adjacent to or in the disturbance. The ones that are adjacent are at about 1,000 and 1,500 feet. Going to the next map, you remember the salt contour map that we showed at the very beginning. This is that same map, but now what I've done is I've overlain a small little area where 1,000-foot gas sand exists, about 3 acres in size. 3. I'm looking for tiny events here. And it looks like it's adjacent to the salt. It looks like it's gas from all of the interpretations and the data volumes that I've looked at. And it is in communication and adjacent to this disturbance volume, or that yellow to green area. So it has an excellent chance to cause bubbling at the surface. The other one is at about 1,500 feet, or 1,450 I call it. It's about 10 acres in size. I feel like I'm talking about a horse race now. 1,450, he's in slot number 4, he's going to be going to the end. But anyway, it's a 9-acre event on the outside of the salt. It's in or at least communication and adjacent to the disturbance was a light area in green. And I feel like that is the best chance, or that is gas in the surface, and it looks to be about 10 acres in size. Next step you do, and I'm going to kind of skip through this quickly, but once you identify these anomalies in the seismic record, you have to model them and compare the model to the real record. And basically you do that by what we call fluid substitution. We have one of the wells out here has a sonic log. We can create a synthetic seismic response from it, and we can inject that seismic model with gas. And when we do, we get I'm going to toggle back and forth between these two next to that yellow arrow, right there, and I get a change in this seismic response when I compare it to the actual rock record. So that's a positive thing, that I can actually model it against the seismic, and I get a good, clear seismic synthetic response. And then I can forward it and actually compare it to the gathers. The gathers are actually all of the traces that make up the seismic section. And when I see a one-dimensional and a two-dimensional model fit, I can say that's a good gas event. So in conclusion, what I'm doing is I'm pulling you up through the last 2 months of work and saying, I'm trying to wrap your arms around what's going on in the subsurface here. And now I have a better appreciation for the subsurface from 0 to 7,000 feet around here. And in this cube, what you see is the yellow is that salt phase that we talked about. Outside the yellow is the disturbance volume, or the maximum area of disturbance, or maximum area of uncertainty for a disturbance boundary. Where the gas is associated to the disturbance, what the oxy-3 cavern response looks like, or at least its outline and where its proximity is to the salt, how the caprock lays on top of the salt, some small faulting that seems to, buried faulting, it's all in the subsurface, that seems to bound the upper portion of the disturbance, which is highlighted in red, all below the sinkhole. The pins on this diagram represent old wellbores drilled between, again, the 20s through 2000. And they're on the outside of the salt, or to the left of the salt. And those were exploration guys looking for oil and gas along the west side of this dome. And for primarily about 90 years, they didn't find anything. So anything that's remaining in the subsurface is going to be right up against the salt dome. And that's what I think we found out here. And that's that gas up here is a very narrow window that's directly underneath the sinkhole. And so when we put this into motion, hopefully I'm going to end up with this slide. This will give you a kind of an appreciation in 15 minutes of 9 months, if I can find the button. I'm going to put this into motion so you can actually see it go. Can't see it. There we go. This is the beauty of 3D. We can look at things from the outside, we can look at things from the inside, put things in perspective versus the cavern, and try to understand the subsurface better. And I think from January to today we've done that. And so now I take all of this interpretation and my best judgment of the data and interpretation of that and port this to the next group of discipline, which is the Blue Ribbon Commission, to take my data, assess its value, assess its accuracy, assess its integrity, and then go forward and use this information to tie in with the shallow sinkhole and determine its longevity and its mitigation. So hopefully that was worth the 2 months of wait, and thank you so much for listening. I really do appreciate it.